Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Today I'll be showing how to blend paint edges in various ways, wet or dry, for watercolor and gouache, as it's a recurring question and challenge for learning artists. I want to thank my loyal patrons for making this info-dense video possible, for asking valuable questions, and for supporting my art and art channel. You know who you are. Thanks for being such excellent birds. And art blogs, Q&As, sketches, deconstructed paintings, video notes, art gifts, and more rewards are available for my patrons on Patreon. So I do blended edges in every video, as every piece will need some soft blended edges and also some hard ones. Many of my videos are sped up to maintain interest and stay focused and streamlined, but if you want to see me do edge blending techniques real time, then check out my real-time art demo playlist from past live streams for lots of examples. And I'm going to show all my edge blending techniques real time in this video so viewers have it as a useful reference video. And I'll have the detailed art notes for my blending techniques up on my Patreon along with all my other info-dense art posts. So let's get on to the blending adventures. Number 1. Hard edges. This will happen automatically in both watercolor and gouache. Just paint a section wet on dry, don't tamper with the edges, and let it dry for automatic hard edges in either watercolor or gouache. The water tension pulls the pigment to the edges of a wet shape, resulting in the hard pigment outlines. As any of these shapes dry, you can see they are resulting in hard edges all around the outlines of each shape for both mediums. Number 2. Wet and wet soft edges. Wet the whole paper or a select shape with water, then apply pigment to the wet paper for soft, bleedy cotton ball edges. A stippling application will give even paint deposits on wet paper, while a stroking application gives uneven, tadpole-shaped paint deposits on the wet paper. It can be tricky to learn water balance here, as you can put down too much water or too little water. If your paint edges don't move, use more water. If your edges and paint flow too much and just blur into nothing, then use a denser paint mixture over the wet paper or wait for the paper to dry a little. And remember, the wet on wet edges are the least controlled of any other edge, hard or soft. The paint is going to bleed in different ways each time, even if you're painting the same shape over and over again. So there's a blessing and a curse that comes with loose wet into wet edges. You can try to gauge where you deposit paint and that'll control it a bit, but you will still get a percentage of random effects you can't control each time. This means you might love the results or maybe not. It's a surprise. Wet and wet soft edges in gouache are done the same way as in watercolor. Just keep in mind that if you're using opaque watercolor or gouache, you'll have some limits to watery layers you can apply before earlier gouache layers start to lift. This might be right after the first layer if you start right in with thicker gouache, or it might be 2 or 3 layers later if you start off using your gouache thin down. And you can do wet and wet edges in any shape or section that you want. Here for both watercolor and gouache, I'm doing wet and wet blurry edges all around the outline of blobby shapes first, then along one side of a long shape, and then in the middle of an enclosed shape. For the enclosed rectangular shapes, notice how the outside edges are hard because they run along a dry perimeter, while the inside paint edges are soft because they blend in the water. Number 3. Wet on dry soft edges. These soft edges are more targeted and deliberate soft edges achieved with a damp, clean brush. This is a more controlled way to get soft, blended out edges. Apply your wet paint in the desired shape on dry paper, then blend out the still wet edge with a damp, clean brush with hardly any water in it. Feel free to add more paint to darken the value and swipe the brush again. If you give straight swipes, you will get a straight, blended edge with a gradient type appearance. And when you're blending out for a soft edge wet on dry, it doesn't have to be on the outside edge. Just like with a wet on wet shape, it can be from the center of a shape, so you have your soft edges on the inside of something. If you poke and dab in with your paint and your blending motion, you're going to get a more random mottled blended edge that you can shape as you desire. Don't forget, when you're blending out an edge, your brush should be lightly damp, not soaking wet, otherwise you're going to get blooms and not a soft blended edge. I use wet on dry soft edges a lot, probably more than any other soft edge in my pieces. These edges are great for detail areas to render and shade and sculpt and shepherd the paint to build a form. For gouache, again, the same technique is used as with watercolor, and again with a few caveats. The first layer of wet on dry soft edges in gouache will be done exactly the same, and that's putting the wet paint down and blending away the edge with a slightly damp, clean brush. But for the second layer onwards in gouache, you'll probably want to use paint to blend your soft edge and not water. Remember, gouache lifts easier and doesn't take kindly to thin paint glazes or water layers. So using the appropriate gouache paint mix for your piece, it could be a lighter or darker color depending on the values you're blending to and from, to blend out an edge is the right idea to prevent mud and lifting. I learned this valuable tip after a lot of frustration and gouache practice on my own, as it wasn't written down or explained in any of the painting books I ever read on gouache. So here I blend out a few gouache edges with water first, and then my later ones I blend out with more gouache paint. a blue tint for one edge, and a brown color for another. As with the watercolor, I vary between swiping straight gradient edges and dabbing mottled edges. Number 4. Lifting semi-hard and semi-soft edges from dried paint areas. This is softening an edge after the paint has dried. It can be done along an outline edge to fix or alter a shape, or used to lift highlights from the center of a shape. You can lift through a stencil or against a paper scrap barrier and then mop the loosened paint up with a tissue, and this will result in a semi-hard edge. And I get some water seeping under my stencil during my first try, resulting in a messy smear on one of the gouache shapes, so be wary of that. You can also brush over your dried paint with a damp, clean brush and gently lift away for semi-soft edges. I prefer this way as it's more predictable than using a stencil, no sudden leaks or smears. Lifted edges and highlights tend to be more crisp and less soft than the wet and wet cottony edges or wet on dry blended gradient or mottled edges shown earlier, but they will still be softer than a solid hard edge. The best way to go about it is to again use a very lightly damp, not wet or soaking brush or sponge or paper towel, scrub gently, and then dab up paint you loosen with a dry towel or tissue. The lifted edges or shapes will look harder and crisper at first and then eventually soften a bit as they dry, since some of the paint disperses slowly back into the edges of the lifted areas. Lifting does depend on your paper and paint. Some paper is great for lifting, others not so much. Likewise, some paints stain more and don't lift well. This technique is the same for both watercolor and gouache, though you will find it will work easier in gouache since the opaque paint sits mostly on the surface and is ripe for lifting back up. And you can lift all of the paint that you can get to come up, or just some of it for a partial highlight or darker blended edges. Number 5. Dry brush edging. Applying thicker, drier paint neat from the tube or pan is called dry brushing. Dry brushing doesn't seem like a natural option for soft edges, but it can be used to emulate soft edges in both watercolor and gouache. Because it hardly uses any water, it works exactly the same with both mediums. It works better and looks softer when it's done over earlier paint glazes, but here I'm just going to be dry brush edging over white paper so my strokes are more visible. Just keep in mind that these same strokes will look more natural and merge better when done over earlier paint layers rather than stark white paper. So for either watercolor or gouache, dry brush paint along a shape edge and the stroke of your choice. I'm showing 4 types here. You can hatch, cross-hatch, stipple dots, or flatten and spread out the hairs of a soft brush, or use a fan brush for a feathery combing dry brush stroke. For large pieces, you can spatter in dots in various densities and masked off areas, but this is too uncontrolled for smaller artwork, and it's not one of the strokes I show here. Whatever dry brush stroke you end up using, taper off in size, density, and value of your strokes, and eventually an optically mixed blended edge or textural gradient will emerge from the value changes. Similar to how pointillism mixes colors from a distance in Impressionist pieces. Dry brush shading is an old technique that was used by botanical painters to create shading and value on finicky papers with finicky paints. But even in modern times, dry brush shading is a great way to boost the values in the shadow regions of your piece or add texture without disturbing lower layers with too much water. If your colors fade once they dry, you can come back with more dry brush value and texture on top until you get the desired depth. The best advice I can give you for both mediums for successful blended edges is water control. Be aware of how much water your brush is smuggling over to your paper. Too much water in a brush is going to create blooms and back bleeds, which are lovely for textural effects, but not for smooth edges. Also, once you are done with whichever edge technique you are doing, leave it alone to dry. Watercolor or gouache will continue to move and bleed while it's wet, so water control also includes shifting to a different area of a piece while you let an earlier wet area just dry before doing more layers there if desired. And check out my 77 effects and techniques for watercolor and gouache for a fast, condensed glossary to refresh your memory, including the ones shown in this video anytime. Well, wizards, that's 5 ways with variations to get all sorts of soft and hard edges with watercolor or gouache. Please like, subscribe, and check out my website links and Patreon page to support my art and art channel below. Thanks for parking your brushes here and wishing you all epic painting adventures.